There's a form of solitude rarely discussed, not the loneliness of the forsaken, but the quiet of those who consciously choose no one. They do not lament, seek, or attach. It is their very serenity that disturbs others. From a Jungian viewpoint, this is more than preference or personality. It is a psychological condition worthy of attention. When an individual actively severs all intimate ties, it often signals an avoidance of introspection, a fear of being truly known, and more profoundly, a refusal to confront their own inner shadow. This does not inherently make them a threat. Yet Jung cautioned that prolonged relational avoidance allows something within to operate in silence. Wounds never addressed, conflicts never voiced. Over time, a person can seal themselves off without even noticing. So, what truly resides within those who walk without companions? Is it the clarity of a mind transcending connection, or an elegant form of self-evasion? Stay until the end, for you may well see a reflection of yourself in the figure Jung once described. Society holds a specific reflex toward those who maintain no close friendships. It is not overt hostility, but something subtler. A gaze held a moment too long. A question posed a concern, yet laced with inspection. Soon, the familiar labels surface. Aloof, strange, different. What is revealing is that this occurs even when the individual lives respectfully, creates no drama, and harms no one. The mere fact they require no intimate web to exist unsettles the group, as if a fundamental rule has been violated. I recall a person like this. He bore no hatred, avoided no necessary interaction. He worked, conversed, and conflicted with no one. Yet after years of maintaining social bonds, he stopped. Not due to any incident, but from a realization. Most encounters cost him more energy than they returned. He grew weary of performing, of upholding an image, of keeping pace. Upon his withdrawal, the reaction was swift. People expressed concern, offered advice to open up. Don't isolate yourself. Though unspoken, his absence made those remaining uneasy. This demonstrates the fear stems not from negative action, but from a different mode of being. A person without close friends does no harm, yet they break a silent assumption. That to live properly, one must be constantly entwined. That withdrawal is a still point amidst relentless motion. It does not obstruct, but it forces others to confront that their own motion may not be entirely chosen. From Jung's framework, this unease springs from a deep psychological layer. Early on, we learn to tether safety to acceptance. The group provide protection. Friendships confirm we move in step with the world. Initially a survival reflex, this becomes an unconscious condition for feeling worthy, blurring true need with ingrained habit. Thus, many bonds persist not from deep affection, but to avoid being alone with oneself. We meet to escape silence. We talk to not hear our inner emptiness. Relationships become a psychological buffer, soothing anxiety through another's presence. When someone does not need that buffer, they become a quiet anomaly. Their difference stirs a fear the majority refuses to name. Jung stated, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." What makes society wary of the friendless is not their solitude, but their capacity to be alone without crumbling. Such a person is not easily swayed by praise or blame, anchored by belonging, or controlled by the dread of exclusion. Their presence poses a silent challenge. If they can be alone and remain whole, what is it that binds the rest of us to connections we dare not leave? Imagine society as a steady machine. Each person is a cog in familiar motion, maintaining the system. When one cog stops turning, the machine doesn't fail, but its operation grows unbalanced. Other parts must compensate. This reveals the system depends more on repetition and accord than on genuine liberty. Anyone who stops, however quietly, exposes this inherent fragility. Therefore, the fear directed at the friendless targets not the individual, but their capacity to unsettle an unconscious or the collective relies upon for security. The solitary walker needs not speak, criticize, or resist. Their existence is itself a mirror, reflecting that many bonds are sustained not for depth, but from dread of the void within. The meaning lies here. The one who walks alone is not a deviation, but a signal that how we seek safety is changing. When society views them warily, it speaks more of a collective fear of inner emptiness than of the nature of those individuals. From this foundation, The psychological journey moves inward, where relationships are no longer a default support, and a person must find what truly sustains them. Understanding society's unease leads us to the silent mechanism at work. We do not seek bonds solely for connection, but to buttress the psychological structure of the self. This dependence is rarely obvious. It is subtle. It hides beneath the quiet belief that only with others present do we exist correctly, feel okay, and remain within life's shared orbit. In literature, Marcel Proust depicted individuals living almost entirely on social validation. They curated words, gestures, and feelings to maintain their place. Superficially content, their identity was built from external gazes, forever fragile. A single withdrawal of attention could make their sense of self waver. Jung saw this as a sign of an ego not grounded internally, but reliant on constant reflection from others. Unchanged, the adult lives as if they exist only when seen, and relationships become a mechanism preventing psychological collapse. Modern psychology calls this codependency. Jung saw a structural issue. Many bonds are kept not from affection, but from fear that the ego will disintegrate in solitude. Without a strong inner center, aloneness feels threatening. Thus, relationships become a frame propping up the ego. When a bond ends, what is lost is not just a person, but the psychic support keeping the self upright. Picture the ego as an unfinished house with a weak foundation. It requires external supports to avoid collapse. Relationships become those supports. They keep the structure standing but prevent it from holding its own weight. The greater the dependence, the greater the terror of their removal. And so the relationship is protected, not for the life within it, but from fear of standing alone in the emptiness. Jung wrote plainly, people would do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. This speaks to the core of dependence. Facing one's inner world demands enduring silence, contradiction, and unresolved fragments. Relationships, used as shelter, allow us to postpone that meeting. In daily life, this is hard to see, for society reinforces it constantly. Being perpetually social is seen as integrated, stable, even successful. Withdrawal is hastily linked to isolation or instability. Gradually, we maintain bonds not because they nourish, but because they shield us from our own emptiness. Dependence becomes invisible, thus seldom questioned. A potent belief, being alone is not acceptable. Unspoken, it shapes behavior, choice, and judgment. When someone needs no bonds to feel okay, they inadvertently expose that belief. And that exposure unsettles the collective. The key is to distinguish connection from dependence. Connection occurs between two individuals who can stand firm within themselves. Dependence occurs when a bond fills an unrecognized void. Jung emphasized a relationship is only truly healthy when built not on fear of loss, but on freedom of choice. When fear is a foundation, the bond becomes a burden, however harmonious it seems. Practically, this requires no grand gestures. It begins by noticing which relationships leave you feeling lighter, and which demand you strain to uphold an image. The former nourishes, the latter is a prop. Seeing this difference opens an inner space where you can be with yourself without panic. In that quiet, a genuine inner independence forms. Unproclaimed, yet unmistakably real. If this section could be distilled, it would be inner sovereignty. Let that phrase settle within you. When a person no longer requires others to affirm their worth, a particular strength crystallizes. It is not loud, confrontational, or eager to prove. Precisely because it needs no proof, it becomes steadier than any social force. In Jung's view, this is not cold attachment, but a sign the psychological center has returned within. A community member once shared a poignant reflection. There came a period when he no longer wished to explain himself to uncomprehending eyes, nor strive to be liked as before, not from bitterness, but because his sense of who I am ceased to depend on others' reactions. The surprise? From that point, he acted with greater clarity and calm. Situations once anxiety-provoking lost their weight, not because he grew conventionally stronger, but because he stopped placing himself where he needed validation. Jung saw this as vital psychological maturation. Most are governed, consciously or not, by the need for recognition. This need weaves an invisible net of control. The ego adjusts thoughts, feelings, and actions to match expectations. So long as one needs approval, one can be led not by a person, but by the fear of collective exclusion. Conversely, the approval indifferent begin to slip this mechanism. They cease reacting to praise or blame, are not yanked by agreement or opposition. This strength is often misread as coldness, aloofness, or lack of feeling. Jung saw the opposite. This individual is not closed off, but has stopped trading inner truth for outer acceptance. They can still care, still connect, but do not stake their identity on being understood or agreed with. That separation creates a freedom most are not prepared to touch. Envision the difference. One who lives on approval watches others' reactions before each step, checking every word for agreement. Their rhythm is pulled by surrounding gazes. The approval indifferent have ceased looking outward. They move by an inner compass. Freed from comparative rhythms, they begin to see what was hidden. Many relationships are exhausting image-keeping exercises. Many connections exist to avoid solitude, not from true attachment. Jung's blunt line fits. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This is not consolation, but a psychological statement. Becoming yourself doesn't mean being liked more. It means accepting you may not be approved, understood, or kept. The approval indifferent have accepted that cost, no longer fearing the loss of consensus. They stop living in a silent negotiation with the world. Their power lies not in controlling others, but in not being easily controlled. You cannot flatter to keep them, ignore to punish them, or use the fear of exclusion to manipulate them. Such a person becomes dangerous in the Jungian sense, not for breaking society, but for proving personal value needs no collective license. Understanding this, application becomes clear. When external approval is no longer required to feel you exist correctly, relationships don't vanish. They simply leave the central position you once forced them to occupy. You can live among people without dissolving, be alone without feeling deficient, and move at your own pace. From that moment, a strength forms, not to impress or oppose, but to live in fidelity to your inner reality. From that quiet strength, a natural distance emerges, not for alienation, but for observation. From that vantage, the silent workings within relationships grow clear once the need for approval no longer obscures the view. Consider Odin from Norse myth, who hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 nights. He did not seek to display power, but to gain sight of what ordinary vision misses. Withdrawing from the familiar, accepting isolation and pain, he sought wisdom of the hidden laws. This mirrors the psychological position of one outside relationships. Withdrawing from habitual interaction to observe, they begin to recognize what was concealed from within. The outsider no longer holds a role, protects an image, or must preserve harmony at all costs. Thus, they see the gap between word and deed, between stated values and unconscious motives. They see bonds maintained for emotional stabilization, links upheld more from dread of emptiness than genuine attachment. This doesn't breed cynicism, but sharper awareness of connection's nature. Scientifically, this isn't mystical. When dependent on bonds for stability, the nervous system often stays on alert, scanning for approval or threat. Energy is spent on self-regulation, narrowing capacity to see fully. When one no longer needs bonds or confirmation, the nervous system softens. From this less reactive state, the brain can identify patterns. Who plays strong to hide insecurity, who plays victim to hold attention, who sustains conflict to feel significant. Jung described it precisely. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. In relationships, much is governed by the unconscious. Patterns repeat because they are familiar, not because they are right. The outsider, unswayed by the need to belong, sees these patterns in operation, not just in their effects. Imagine stepping outside a stage play. Everyone is engrossed in their role, reacting to lines and gazes. Outside, the picture becomes whole. You see who strains for acceptance, who hides behind familiar parts, how old scripts repeat. The outsider sees a social life this way, without acting. They perceive what is truly happening. This explains why their presence discomforts others, not because they speak truth, but because they do not participate in collective denial. In many groups, unspoken agreements exist about what can be said and what must remain silent to keep peace. a hollow relationship, a power upheld by emotion, a role long ceased to be real. The outsider sees these without needing to criticize. Their mere refusal to help sustain the pretense threatens the system. Jung termed this a clash between individual consciousness and the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious operates via silent pacts about normality and deviation. The outsider, free from dependence on approval, no longer obeys these pacts unconsciously. When someone doesn't obey, the structure reveals its fragile, hidden points. Crucially, the outsider's gaze isn't meant to wound. It stems not from moral superiority, but a different psychological position. When one doesn't need relationships to survive, one can see them as they are, not as one needs them to be. From that gaze, illusions dissolve, not by force, but from lack of nourishment. Pause here briefly. Let your breath slow, without overthinking. Simply notice if, in the relationships around you, something has grown clearer since you stepped back a single pace. Breathe in slowly. Exhale gently. From the position outside relationships, attention inevitably turns inward. No longer pulled into roles and expectations, one begins to face their own shadow. In this phase, stillness brings not relief, but discomfort. Externally, nothing changes. Internally, turbulence stirs. Familiar thoughts loop. Emotions without clear source surface. Reactions believed outgrown return. For Jung, this is not regression, but consciousness beginning to touch previously hidden parts. With no relationship to distract, the unconscious speaks. In a therapeutic context, a woman, let's call her Lena, experienced this. Her outer life was stable, yet as she spent more time alone, unexplained sadness and irritability arose. No one was hurting her, which confused her. What surfaced were not new problems, but emotions suppressed because she always had to be okay in relationships. Solitude didn't create her darkness. It removed the old coverings. For Jung, the shadow is not morally bad, but all that the ego denies within itself. When living constantly among others, much inner material is projected outward through roles and expectations. We are so busy reacting, we avoid looking deeply within. In sufficient solitude, with nowhere left to project, everything returns to its source. Qualities once labeled in others, selfishness, weakness, envy, neediness, emerge as parts of ourselves. The shadow appears not to punish, but to demand recognition. Many abandon this stage. They rush back to old bonds, fill time, create new connections, anything to avoid the raw inner reality. Jung called this the natural reflex of an ego not yet strong enough to endure its own truth. But he stressed that avoiding this passage means living forever on the surface of oneself. The shadow, when avoided, doesn't vanish. It manifests elsewhere in distorted relationships, exaggerated reactions, or repeating conflicts. Jung's famous line captures this. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This doesn't advocate dwelling in darkness, but states that psychological growth requires acknowledging what is difficult to accept. Remaining alone long enough forces one to see the unnamed parts. Only when brought to consciousness do they cease controlling life invisibly. Picture someone long walking the noise of feedback and roles. While immersed, every reaction has an external cause. Deep silence is absent when that person is alone long enough, not by force, but as a natural consequence. The noise quiets, layer by layer, like a power cut gradually bringing stillness. Meeting the shadow isn't only encountering negative emotions. It is also rediscovering restrained vitality. The decisiveness you fear to show, the desire for freedom labeled selfish, the need for solitude called cold. Many are surprised to find their shadow holds unlived potential, not just anger or fear. Sufficient solitude creates space for these parts to surface, not for immediate action, but for acknowledgement. This process demands patience. Jung warned that facing the shadow too abruptly or in total isolation can overwhelm. Yet total avoidance forfeits growth. The balance is staying long enough to recognize, without forcing immediate resolution. The shadow need not be fixed. It needs a conscious relationship. To apply this, simply create periods of solitude without rushing to fill them. Don't use them to seek answers or perfect yourself. Simply abide with what arises within, slowly enough not to interfere, quietly enough not to flee. In that silent presence, what was hidden no longer needs to speak through tension or unconscious acts. It gradually finds its rightful place. When inner life begins to stand steady in this way, the journey Jung called individuation truly opens, not as theory, but as a fundamental shift in how one inhabits oneself. Having passed through sufficient silence and dared to face their shadow, a person realizes they no longer require belonging to feel they exist correctly. This inner independence is what makes a friendless seem dangerous in Jung's eyes, not for opposing society, but for being unmoved by the fear of exclusion or hunger for acceptance. As the need to belong recedes from the psychological center, a new space opens. One begins to live from within, not in reaction to without. A classic example is Henry David Thoreau. Withdrawing to Walden Pond was seen as eccentric, even irresponsible. Yet Thoreau did not leave to avoid people, but to escape the silent expectations dictating life. Freed from the common rhythm, he saw more clearly what shaped people internally and wrote ideas ahead of his time. His freedom came not from recognition, but from no longer needing it to live by his truth. Jungian psychology sees this as the moment the ego relinquishes its front-seat control. When needing to belong, the ego constantly checks surroundings to adjust itself, living by comparison. As that need weakens, the ego steps back, allowing a deeper center, the self, to become the axis. From this point, action springs not from fear or craving, but from inner congruence. Jung wrote a key line for this state. Individuation does not shut one out from the world, but gathers the world to itself. This corrects a common mistake. Ceasing to need belonging doesn't create distance. Rather, one meets the world from a firmer ground. The world ceases to be a place to seek permission or seat. It becomes a place for encounter. Relationships then are chosen for true vitality, not to fill a void. In daily life, this freedom manifests in subtle shifts. One no longer rushes to reply just for agreement, over-explains to avoid misunderstanding, or stays in bonds that make them shrink from fear of losing connection. They can still engage, still care, but no longer trade inner truth for outer peace. This makes them unpredictable to the old system, for they no longer react to its familiar buttons. Look closely. Society operates largely on belonging reflexes. From childhood, we learn acceptance equals safety, separation equals danger. But when someone has journeyed deeply inward, that reflex loses its absolute power. They realize true safety comes not from resembling others, but from not betraying oneself. Living this truth without proclamation creates a freedom that is hard to manipulate. Practically, this doesn't require leaving society. It starts by discerning which bonds you keep for their aliveness, and which you keep only from fear of lost connection. When you stop forcing yourself into spaces that drain your inner life, and allow distance from circles existing merely by habit, a new order forms, not of isolation, but of conscious choice. When you no longer need to belong, you don't lose community. You simply cease trading yourself to remain within it. Jungian freedom is practical, the ability to live without constant adjustment to surrounding gazes, to walk without looking back to see if you're being left behind, to connect without using relationships as a psychological life raft. Ultimately, what matters is not how many connections you have, but whether you must still trade your inner truth just to be allowed to stay. When the need for approval no longer steers each choice, one doesn't separate from life. They enter it with a steadier anchor. From that position, freedom is no longer an escape. It is the capacity to be present among others without fearing the loss of oneself. Here, the picture completes. The solitary individual no longer appears as a figure to avoid, but as a quiet mirror reflecting what society often ignores. Inner freedom emerges only when one no longer needs belonging to feel valuable. From Jung's perspective, this is not withdrawal from life, but the sign of an ego sturdy enough not to be ruled by fear, expectation, or the crowd's approval. Perhaps each of us has met such a person, or glimpsed that image within ourselves. In a private moment, when we no longer wish to blend in merely to be allowed to stay. Those silent moments are rarely loud, yet they can be profound enough to alter how we view relationships, belonging, and the price paid to avoid being the one outside. Thank you for accompanying me on this exploration.